We want all people treated equally. So there's no economic justification for doing it. So there's been a movement to get rid of it. In 2017, they weren't able to get rid of it, but they were able to cap it at $10,000. But for people like yourself and myself, I live in the DC area, and home values are high here, and I pay very high property taxes. And for us, sure, it'd be nice to deduct your taxes, but the problem is that what that does, it does a bunch of things. It encourages people to buy larger homes than they would otherwise buy. It also, because they only pay a portion, for every dollar of state and local tax which is taken out of their wallets, they only pay 65 cents or whatever. And because of that, they both allow the government to get larger than it would otherwise be.
Americans are capable of achieving extraordinary things when they have the freedom and opportunity to do so. This is American Potential.
Hey everyone, welcome to the American Potential Podcast. I'm your host, David Fromm. Have you ever sat down to fill out your tax forms and thought, why is this so complicated and confusing? Our tax system has been just a maze of red tape, loopholes, and just frankly confusion. But the One Big Beautiful Bill passed this past July laid the groundwork to start changing some of that. It simplifies the tax code, lowers rates, and puts money back where it belongs, in the hands of families, workers, and small businesses. In today's episode, we'll break down how the bill tackles taxes, what it means for job creators and everyday Americans, and how it's a big win really for everyone. I want to welcome back to the podcast Patrick Fleenor, who is the Tax Policy Fellow for Americans for Prosperity. Patrick, welcome.
David, thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, we're happy to have you. And I'm happy to talk about one of our favorite topics. I've always enjoyed taxes. Well, right. That's actually wrong. I've enjoyed working against higher taxes. No, and trying to eliminate taxes. Spent a lot of my career working on that. And
right.
So I'm actually really excited about some of the developments that we saw from the One Big Beautiful Bill.
Sure.
As a podcast and as an organization, we've been talking about these tax cuts for the better part of the year, and spent a lot of time kind of trying to highlight why it was so important to job creators and families. So Now that we're on the other end of it, that the policy's in place, I'm really excited for us to explore it. So, the One Big Beautiful Bill does a lot of things, but it also stopped something from happening. What was the big thing that it stopped?
Right. Perhaps the biggest thing it did was stop the largest tax hike in U.S. history. That tax hike would have been sweeping. It would have affected basically all families in America, from coast to coast. So, that in and of itself was a big victory, just, stopping. The tax hike was essentially on autopilot, and the One Big Beautiful Bill basically put that to an end. So, taxes remained relatively low. I think they could go a lot lower, but the One Big Beautiful Bill did stop the biggest tax hike in U.S. history. So that's a huge accomplishment in and of itself.
Absolutely. We really, on this show, we've had I'd say 10 to 12 business owners who really talked very directly about what the first iteration of these tax cuts in 2017 did for their business. And man, I've tried to take those stories, and if I'm speaking to a group, I was talking to a group in Pennsylvania on Friday night, and I was telling the story about a gentleman who we talked to who owns a tower building business in rural Ohio. He's the largest job creator, employer in his county. And he told us very directly that as a result of those tax cuts in 2017, he paid right off the bat all of his employees 30% more in salary.
Right.
Then he invested in his business, bought trucks, employed more people, so that he's now even the bigger employer. And then we had so many other people who talk about very direct benefits. And so it's so exciting, one, that's going to continue. But it's also pretty scary that, the left was very willing to pull those back and penalize these businesses. And, what kind of a dramatic effect would it have had on our economy?
Well, it would have been huge. There, as you mentioned, there's a number of very large two of the big provisions in the bill were allowing for what's called expensing or immediate deduction of equipment purchases and R&D expenditures as well. And those are important because, people's wages are dependent on how the capital that they have in their hands. To put that in sort of layman's terms, that means, if we give people better tools to do their jobs, be it an equipment operator, they get the latest truck or what have you, or, an office worker, the latest computer on their desk, that just makes them more productive. And productivity is the ultimate driver of wages. I mean, the reasons we have high wages in this country is because we're relatively more productive than other parts of the world. So that's something we want to focus on. We want to, continuously come up with ways of making the American workforce more and more productive. And unfortunately, prior to the passage of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which was extended by the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, the tax code actually essentially levied a tax on both new investment in new plant and equipment and R&D expenditures. So those were two very big and important provisions in the act, which fortunately were extended, and not only extended but extended permanently. So those are part of the U.S. tax code now until they're changed, which hopefully they won't be changed. So those are two of the highlights of the act.
Yeah. So, I mean, if somebody was thinking about starting a business, how do you think the developments in this bill kind of might help them do so?
Oh, absolutely. Right. Because now there's certainty, right? I mean, one of the problems before was that there wasn't certainty about, just even the individual rates that people would pay, right? Those were basically, again, on autopilot, scheduled to go back up to their 2017 levels. But now the act basically, the important provisions in the One Big Beautiful Bill are permanent now. So people have an idea not only of what they're going to pay this year, but what they'll pay a decade or more from now. So, that's very important.
My understanding is also that this might make it easier for people to file their taxes. Are there some provisions that address that?
Well, there it's a mixed bag. I mean, one of the important provisions of both the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act and the One Big Beautiful Bill was the expansion of the standard deduction.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason that's important is because for a large percentage of the population now, the standard deduction is more than they would possibly get from itemizing their deductions. As a result, people can just claim the standard deduction and don't need to keep a bunch of records about, what their mortgage interest was or what they paid in state and local taxes. So that simplifies things greatly. And that's kind of the direction we'd like to move, right? We'd like to move toward a much more simple, tax code where you didn't spend a lot of, time and money, doing nothing more than just calculating how much you owe. And so in some respects, the One Big Beautiful Bill eased tax compliance. However, in others, it was kind of a step backward. I mean, a couple of provisions that jump that make you think about this are some of the most prominent, which would be the no tax on tips and the no tax on overtime. The problem there is that, right, if you allow a provision like that, everyone basically tries to game the system so that the compensation that they're paid is somehow taxed at these lower rates. And then the IRS responds by coming up with a bunch of complicated rules saying only these occupations are subject to these provisions, and that they can only claim so much of their income. So much of their income is taxed at the no tax level. Other is taxed at the regular rates. So you get when you have special provisions like that, you basically introduce complexity to the system. A much better way to give tax relief, it seems to me, is to make it broad-based. Again, sort of the classic broad-based, low rates, tax systems where, rather than just give it to a specific portion of the population or specific occupations or what have you, we have the tax cuts are basically, universally applicable to everyone. And they're created in a simple manner, so either like a very large standard deduction, or perhaps even better yet, just an across the board rate cut, because those help everyone. And the economy, I mean, the most beneficial tax cuts for the economy as a whole are, broad-based tax cuts, which move us to, again, a broader tax base with lower tax rates on everyone.
Well, it kind of brings it to one of the myths that the left has pushed a lot. Of course, the traditional one of, these tax cuts are only helping the rich. I think that's even just what you said now, that seems to be undermined by the facts. But maybe can you address that?
Sure. What confuses a lot of people about that, and it's kind of what we talked about earlier, is that, that two of the big provisions in the one big beautiful bill were these business specific provisions about expensing and about R&D expenditures. And people kind of assume naively that the benefit of that only accrues to the business owner, right? But that's false, because in many ways, let's look at the depreciation for the equipment depreciation first. Depreciation, when your company buys you a new computer and that computer makes you more productive, ultimately that will raise your wages. And so that equipment expenditure, just the benefit of it just does not accrue to the owner of the company. It also accrues to the workers as well, especially on an economy-wide basis. And then the second thing is the R&D. It's a similar thing. But companies are allowed to prior to this, they weren't allowed to deduct the full cost of R&D expenditures. They were only able to subtract a portion of them. And what that did was it implicitly taxed R&D expenditures. And that's really not a great thing if you think about it, because the U.S., the average person in the U.S. benefits enormously, because so much of the world's research and development goes on in the U.S. And that's something we want to encourage. I mean, if you just think about all the jobs in the U.S. that are, driven by innovations and, trying to come up with the latest generations of computing. The big thing currently, of course, is AI. But we want that to happen in the U.S. We don't want that to happen in other countries. And the thing is that if you start implicitly taxing innovation, that's just going to drive things offshore, and that's going to hurt us. And sort of going back to address your initial thing, it's just, if you just think about all the jobs that are in the U.S. that flow because we are an innovation hub, you just realize that, that a provision like that just, it creates broad-based benefits to all Americans, really. And, workers in particular as well. So.
Well, I think, it's important for people to realize jobs can go elsewhere.
Absolutely.
We see that from state to state all the time based on the tax code and regulations and all that. But, so we see that flow easily, but it happens internationally all the time too.
Absolutely.
We do not want to be in a position where jobs continue to go to China or somewhere else in the Far East or any other place that's really presenting a more favorable regulatory or certainly tax environment. I mean, we need to stay competitive, because there are a lot of advantages being here, but, companies make a calculation eventually where it makes sense for them to spend their time and to file so that they can maximize their profits. But and we need to make that calculation say that America is the best place to be. And so
Absolutely.
I'm kind of happy with a lot of these provisions.
Right. I mean, people often blame foreigners for our domestic economic problems, but a lot of this damage is self-imposed by, again, prior to the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, but the provisions were extended by the One Big Beautiful Bill, is we essentially, I mean, as crazy as it sounds, we taxed R&D expenditures in the U.S. I mean, that just seems like a very bad idea, right? I mean, in the same way, there was basically an implicit tax levied on when your boss or when your employer bought you a new computer. And that just seems, again, those are self-imposed things, which, don't have to be decrease America's competitiveness. There are things that are in our control. We can make a better tax system. And it seems to me, those are what the things we should be focusing on, right? Improving the business climate in the U.S., making things better by doing things like, allowing equipment expensing, and allowing research and development costs to be expensed as well. So a lot of things are in our hands, and I think we should focus on those. Focus on the things you can control.
So switching gears a little bit, if you listen to the debate, a lot of people heard one of the negotiating items was around the state and local tax, or the SALT tax.
Right.
In full disclosure, as a resident of suburban Chicago, I pay incredibly high property taxes and relatively high state taxes. And so, I understand both sides of this argument. But maybe we can talk to people about what the SALT tax debate was, going back to 2017, and then, what happened in the bill this year.
Sure. Well, the SALT tax it's until 2017, it's been in the tax code basically since its inception. And there's a lot of things in the tax code actually which were bad ideas, but public finance, or the science of public finance, has just improved so much since 1913 that it gives us an opportunity to improve the code as well. And the SALT tax basically allows people to deduct, people who reach a threshold. Again, going back, there's always been a standard deduction. For a lot of people, it just makes more economic sense to claim the standard deduction because it's larger than the sum total of, say, the charitable deductions, the mortgage deduction, and their state and local tax deduction. So the people who itemize are able to deduct their state and local tax deductions, but there's no real, their state and local taxes, but there's no real reason people should be allowed to do that. The economic justification for allowing people only, because renters can't do that, right? We want the tax code to be general. We want all people treated equally. So there's no economic justification for doing it. So there's been a movement to get rid of it. In 2017, they weren't able to get rid of it, but they were able to cap it at $10,000. But for people like yourself and myself, I live in the DC area, and home values are high here, and I pay very high property taxes. For us, sure, it'd be nice to deduct your taxes, but the problem is what that does is it does a bunch of things. It encourages people to buy larger homes than they would otherwise buy. It also, because they only pay a portion, for every dollar of state and local tax, which is taken out of their wallets, they only pay 65 cents or whatever. And because of that, they both allow the government to get larger than it would otherwise be. And they're also less, because the government's only to them, at least, because they're allowed to make the deduction, because the government's only imposing a 65 cent cost on them for every dollar it takes out. They're probably less involved with the government. They're less concerned about what the government's doing, how much of a burden it's actually placing on the local residents or the state residents. There's just a lot of problems associated with the state and local deduction. And for that reason, again, it's kind of what we talked about earlier. The wise thing to do would be to give sort of if you're going to give a deduction like that, let's make it wide, and we'll give it to everyone. We'll have a larger standard deduction in lieu of the state and local deduction. But of course, people living in high tax areas don't like that. So they fought it. And this time they held a lot of political sway because the margins in the House were very small. So unfortunately, the state and local tax deduction was pushed back up to $40,000 a year. There's some other limits placed on it, but that's probably a step backward in the sort of the tax reform debate. We would like a situation where the tax system was more broad-based and then lower rates overall.
Well, it seems to me it's a symptom of excessive state and local spending.
Absolutely.
And thereby excessive local and state taxation. I mean, I folks who listen to this might know, but I grew up in New Jersey, and I've lived almost my entire adult life in suburban Illinois or in Chicago, and I've experienced excessive local and state taxation far too much. But I mean, that's what this is a symptom of, is people are looking for relief from excessive local taxation and excessive spending, which kind of brings me to another part of the One Big Beautiful Bill. I mean, a huge part of spending is entitlements for our federal government. And then we had some real entitlement reform in the One Big Beautiful Bill. Can you kind of talk about those?
Sure. We didn't have enough. I mean, as you say, our fiscal future is basically being driven and being determined by growth of entitlements. And while the One Big Beautiful Bill didn't do nearly enough, what it did do by trimming some entitlement spending, albeit very, relatively small, is that it showed that it could be done, and that the trimming entitlements, or at least placing some limits on them, wasn't the third rail of politics that everyone talks about, right? That it showed, it was sort of a proof of concept that you could trim entitlements and still survive politically. And I think perhaps, that's its biggest. The cuts that were made were relatively minor. Were really not cuts, right? They're just they're caps in future spending. They were relatively minor. However, again, proof of concept that showed that, it could be done. There are ways of addressing these problems. And again, our fiscal future is almost entirely driven by growth of on the entitlement sector. It's not, you hear the debate over what's called the discretionary side of the budget, and that's what makes the news. But it's this slow growth of, three programs, Medicare, Social Security, and Medicaid, that basically drives, a very large fraction of the budget. And that's more or less on autopilot. And unless we do something about that, there's really just that fraction of the budget basically gets larger every year. And that if we don't do something basically to what they call bend the curve, or to, bring those under control, we're going to, the fiscal, our fiscal future looks very dim. And there's really no way, like, people just say, well, we can raise taxes to get our way out of that. But that's really not an option, because these burdens are so large that, say you raise taxes, you have to raise taxes to such a level that it wouldn't be worthwhile for people to do things like work, right? Or save. So that's one that's not a viable option, is to raise taxes, because simply the tax increases have to be too high. So people say, well, we can borrow. But the problem there is it's the size of this problem is so large that you'd have to go out and start borrowing money from, you'd end up competing with private firms, and private firms need that money to do things like, again, invest in in equipment and buildings and other things to make things. And if the government had to borrow a lot of money, it would drive up interest rates, and it would be prohibitively costly for companies to meet their borrowing requirements. So, yeah, so we have to bring it under. We need to bring mandatory spending under control, and to this point, politicians have been very reluctant to do that. But one of the beauties of the One Big Beautiful Bill is that it showed that there is a viable path forward.
Yeah, I think that is a real kind of bright light to this, because you're totally right. looking at entitlements and their growth is just a depressing task, but it's necessary. And the fact that there was some willingness, because I mean, frankly, Congress has seemed to lack a willingness to do anything for a long time. And, and then we see some other packages come through. So just as we wrap up, like, what else can Congress look at doing when it comes to taxes or spending?
Sure. On the tax front, I think what sort of the North Star that we should always keep in mind is we want to move toward a system where, here's a kind of an interesting, the Tax Foundation recently came out with a publication that showed that we spend the equivalent of about 2% of GDP simply complying, filling out forms and complying with the federal tax code. All right. Obviously, that's way too much of a fraction of our national income to be spending on, complying with the tax code. All right. So what we should do for a bunch of reasons is move to a system of a much more simple tax system and the way to get there is through broadening the tax base to basically include, say, all income or all consumption or whatever we're going to make our tax base be. And then we want to tax those at very low rates. The reason that is because the lower the rates, the less damage the tax system does. Kind of an interesting statistic is that when you double a tax rate, the damage from a tax doesn't also double. It goes up by a square of what you double. So, if you go from 10 to 20, it goes up fourfold rather than double. So you want to keep rates what we learned from that is you want to keep rates as low as possible. You want a broad base because then everyone, bears a burden of the tax system. There aren't, people outside the tax system who aren't paying anything. And so we want a broad-based tax system with low rates. And then on the entitlement front, right, there's no free lunch. And that, sure, people benefit from these entitlements, but the thing is they have a lot of pernicious effects. One thing Social Security does, for example, is it discourages people from saving for their own retirement. That's kind of a bad thing, right? Because it makes them more dependent on the government. It also decreases the pool of savings that is available economy-wide to fund things like, investment by companies or, investment in homes and things like that, commercial credit. So those, the downside of these entitlements should be considered, when we're considering about what to do with them. There's both good and bad sides of these entitlement programs, which I think should be, taken into consideration and weighed.
Well, I'm so excited that, Patrick, that we got a guy like you keeping an eye on this stuff. We have someone like a smart guy like you at Americans with Prosperity who's working on this and fighting that fight up on Capitol Hill and alongside other policy organizations, and that you can come on here and help us make sense of this all. So,
well, hopefully I do that. And look, people like you are our activists, right? I often think they're the most. They're the face of the organization, and they are actually. It's not people like me who influence politicians. It's really them, right? Because they both confront their legislators directly, and they also encourage other people to take our message to them. So, the role that they play in this organization, I think it was invaluable.
Yeah, it's definitely central. I think
absolutely.
I hope this podcast plays some of this role, but the work that you're doing, we're giving intellectual ammunition to folks to go and make their voices heard with their legislators and the policymakers so that we can get better results. And I think that the One Big Beautiful Bill is a great example of that, of mobilizing those voices. We're going to keep trying to tell those stories about, that, even though taxes aren't fun, the reforms that we saw in the One Big Beautiful Bill are going to have an impact on individuals and families and growing businesses, allowing people to be employed and keep more of their own paychecks, and having businesses hire new workers. I think that as we keep reminding policymakers that that's the case, and I think we can keep highlighting the stories of the men and women who for whom this is a real reality because they are hiring people or they're bringing home more in their paychecks. And we say, hey, we want more of this. We need to spend less because the government's, growing too much at the federal or state or the local level. So, but I appreciate you coming on here and giving us some of the details and the intellectual ammunition that we need.
Well, thanks for having me. I enjoyed it.
Awesome. Same here, Patrick. Thanks.
All right.
Well, folks, if you like this episode and would like to stay connected with the podcast, be sure to like and subscribe to our channel, as well as following us on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. Always remember, liberty and freedom are easily taken for granted. Don't take it for granted. Go out there and defend freedom and liberty. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you on the next episode.
Thank you for listening to American Potential. You may listen to more stories from Americans working every day to expand freedom and opportunity in their communities by visiting AmericanPotential.com.